All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome back. We are in Ballroom AB. I want to thank our sponsor, Prowler, which is a leading open source tool for multi-cloud security best practice assessment, auditing, and hardening. It helps identify vulnerabilities, ensure compliance, and improve cloud security posture with comprehensive checks and actionable insights. AWS recommends Prowler for its robust security and compliance management capabilities. I want to introduce our speaker, Lizzie, who's going to talk to us about open sourcing AWS Pentest methodology. Welcome her to the stage.
Hi, and welcome to my talk on AWS Pentest methodology, and specifically open sourcing it. So I want to go into a quick background of myself before we dive into the methodology, just to lay some stuff out. So I've been in the cloud security community for a while now. Most of it was actually as a project manager. So I was the first project manager for Rhino Security Labs, where I worked with people like Spencer Geetson and other folks who were releasing Paku and tools like CloudGoat. I'm now a security consultant, specifically a pen tester over at Leviathan Security Group. And the joke that I like to make about that is I switched from project management where I was basically paid for my anxiety for timelines, and now I get paid for my paranoia about your environment. So in my free time, I also write blog posts. You might have seen some of them, including the talk here, which is my AWS Pentest methodology. I also did recently release some research that got some publicity for Tunnel Vision, which was VPN research. So you might also recognize me from that. So some disclaimers before we jump into it. My thoughts and opinions are my own, and we are on the customer side of the shared responsibility model. This is the outline for what we're going to be talking about, but it is basically prior methodology, the methodology that I wrote, and we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty there, and then what I see as the future of AWS Pentest methodology with a focus on open sourcing it. A quick call to action. If you are a pen tester, I would like some help open sourcing and writing this and making sure that it's structured in a good way. And if you are a person who knows a good place to host and maintain it, you should also be reaching out to me, because I would greatly appreciate that. So to get started here, we need to talk about what a pen test methodology actually is. And the way that I like to visualize it is more of a framework for a pen tester to operate from. So this allows us to make sure that we're covering attack surface, we're being efficient with the time that we have for a project, and we're also trying to get consistent results between projects and also between practitioners. And there's an additional thing here that I'm going to go into much more detail about, which is context, and how to get as much context as possible. So when I was doing my research, I was looking at prior methodologies that existed. And the first one that I came across was actually from the Cloud Security Alliance back in 2019. And this is an excerpt from it. And there's some good parts about it, which is that it was ahead of the curve, because back in 2019, there wasn't a whole bunch of people talking about pen test methodology. And it used things like Stride and focused on threat modeling. And it also provided resources to learn from. But it also does some weird stuff. Like, for example, if you notice here, it'll actually say that spoofing is the same thing as assuming a role or having various forms of credentials, which is kind of odd. And I think that's more because Stride is built more for on-premise versus on-cloud, or on-cloud. But there are some other rooms for improvement, which is that it wasn't really considering AWS organizations or service control policies. And it also was focused around testing a single account. So there wasn't really multi-account architectures that were taken into account. And of course, it also likes black box, and I'm going to get into more detail later why I don't really like black box when it comes to cloud pen testing. There is another form of methodology here, which is actually in a wiki structure from the folks at WithSecure. And they did a great job with creating this wiki and make it free and available. And they did things like have a generalized section as well as service-specific subguides. So those were very tailored to services and recommendations they had for checking it out. There was some room for improvement because they also didn't mention organizations or service control policies. And also the maintenance was a little bit behind. So when I talked to the folks at WithSecure, they mentioned that they actually maintain two different versions, where there's an internal version that might have proprietary stuff, and then there's the external version. So making sure that those two were up to date and synced is a big challenge and something that is difficult to do. Overall, I would say that if you're referring to this documentation, it's much better when you're looking at it from a cloud configuration review rather than a pen test. But it's still very helpful. Oh, excuse me. So if we're summing up the problems that I was seeing when I was about to create my own methodology, I was seeing that there wasn't really multi-account architectures. And I was looking at it from the perspective of, I want something that's going to match my workflow rather than something that's a reference document. Also something that's easy to maintain so that it didn't go out of date and would help me with something I'm calling relevant context gathering. And context is something that is probably the most important thing in my mind for cloud pen testing, because this is the thing that will allow you to make better recommendations to your client, to determine severity of issues, and also make sure that you're removing things like false positives. The more context that you have, the better. And inside of all the cloud security forum Slack threads, usually you'll see something like context is king. And I agree with that sentiment. But context is also a buzzword. Because what are we actually talking about when we're talking about context? And I have my own mental model for this. So I like to think about it in two different categories for pen testing, which is that you have general cloud and cloud security context. These are things like, I know about IAM, and I know about IAM privilege escalation. There's also project and client context. And this is things like, the scope is we have 3 accounts, and we also really don't care about CIS benchmarks unless they actually have risk behind them, which is something that I hear commonly. So relevant context, in my mind, is the intersection of those two things. And this is what's going to allow you to make those recommendations because you understand both of these forms of context and there's overlap. So how do we actually go about getting more relevant context? Well, there's a couple of approaches that you can do. The first one is you might grow your own knowledge of cloud and cloud security. So you might do things like go out and read Nick Frichette's encyclopedia. You might go out and read all the security research. But in most cases, this is going to be months or years of work. So if we're talking about being a consultant, which I am, you usually have weeks or days rather than months to try to get this relevant context. So a much better approach in my mind is to instead understand more about your project and your client context. So that's how I approach relevant context in my own methodology. Speaking of my methodology, I was looking at those gaps and I thought to myself, how hard could it actually be to just write something that's my own? And I thought, maybe it'll take a month and then I'll submit it to Forward CloudSec and I'll have a talk. That was last year. And about 6 months after that, I decided that 80% was good enough, and I was just going to publish it to my Medium blog. So I did that, and it was pretty well received. But the reason that it takes so long to create documents like this is because it's really hard to make definitive statements about the cloud. Because there's people like Daniel Grezlak who are going to come across something weird in S3 and then write a whole blog post about things that contradict what you would assume to be things you could make claims about. And those are all over the place. So that's why it's so difficult. But talking more about my methodology, how I like to view it is in kind of 3 different camps. So you start with automated things, and that's going to be your time saving, and that's going to be your efficiency. And then you're going to also consider things from a manual context gathering point of view. And we're going to go into much more detail about that. And then lastly, you actually have to try those things that you're coming up with. So when we're talking about access, I like to have 2 forms of access when I'm on a pen testing engagement for cloud. The first one is white box access. So that allows us to run automated tools to get all the visualization that's possible, and it allows us to get as much context as we possibly can at the start. We also want assumed breach access. So this is essentially whatever situation your client's most worried about. If they're worried about like GitHub credentials being leaked, things like that, or a compute instance getting compromised, and then somebody has credentials now. So these might vary from client to client, but there's kind of categories, and I would recommend starting with whichever one they're most worried about. Actually, when you're considering how these accounts are being used, this is probably the first step that you're going to want to do is meet with your client. And this is my project management background coming into, I guess, my pen testing. But I like to meet with my clients and get things like diagrams and documentation. And I like to particularly meet with them one-on-one if I can, So that way I can get more candid feedback about what they actually think about their environments and the risks that they see. And just a tip here, if you're coming across conflicting documentation or diagrams, that's a great note that you should have because that's probably where some dragons are. So that's kind of the human element that I like to inject at various levels here, where it's just meeting with folks. But we also can use that white box access for automated tools that help visualize how the account's being used. So there's tools like PMapper, and there's a specific fork that I like from, I think it's Justin Moorcroft. And there's also 3 different blog posts that I've listed here from Michael Kirshner, who does great work for visualizing and kind of orienting yourself inside of a cloud account. So now that we understand how these accounts are being used, we have to find things that anybody could find. And these are using tools like Scout Suite or Prowler or CSPMs and making sure that you're doing it for each of these accounts. And you're going to be identifying programmatically these attack paths. But there's an important caveat to this, which is that not all services are covered by these automated checks. So in those cases, you're either going to have a gap in coverage or you're going to have to go do that manually. So we're done with the automation piece now in my methodology, but now we need to do the manual work. But before we do that, I want to take a step back and talk about what our goals are as a pen tester. And it's kind of what I see as the opposite of a developer, where a developer is trying to work with abstractions. They're trying to create black boxes to then build off of and make something bigger and better. Whereas for pen testers, we kind of want to start from a low level and then rebuild that abstraction, but based off of what we understand as fact or things that we can demonstrate and prove. So the way that I like to do this is I like to consider an AWS count in what I call logical levels. There's probably a better name for it, but this is the one that I came up with, where you start with looking at a single service. Then you start looking at how those services interact with each other. And then lastly, how the accounts might interact with each other as well. So that'll allow you to go from an abstract idea of an environment to building up slowly what I would consider the context and relevant context about an environment. But what are we actually going to do with all this relevant context that I keep talking about? Well, we're going to make attack paths with it. We're going to start treating those attack paths as a hypothesis, and then we're going to use that assumed breach access that I talked about earlier to prove or disprove those attack paths through dynamic testing. So how do we actually go about assessing a single service? Well, what I like to do is I like to look at research and publicly known misconfigurations or issues. Also, reading through the documentation is exceptionally helpful, especially if it's a service that you're not familiar with. Throughout this, you're going to be making attack paths. So an example of an attack path might be you're seeing this Lambda that has a role attached to it, and that role has a ton of permissions. Well, maybe that's something you should note down as something to check for a privilege escalation path. And of course, there are some services that are brand new and don't have any research associated with them. And a tip that I like to use for that is I like to look at what I call adjacent services, so services that are kind of in the same category, where you might be looking at a compute service and look at other compute services that do have research. And when you're looking at that research, you might find things that overlap or would be applicable to the service you are now testing or looking for misconfigurations for. So once we've done that for all the different services, we can start to look at how are the services using each other, what are they dependent on, and kind of this perspective of them interacting with each other. And this is where we're going to find even more notes to take for attack paths. Things like, oh, well, that Lambda that I was flagging as something that might be a good privilege escalation vector, it looks like it's reliant on some code that's in an S3 bucket, or an S3 object, rather. And you might have permissions for that from your assumed breach position. So you would probably want to consider, could I modify that code in some way that's malicious and get that actual Lambda role credential to then get privilege escalation? So these are the kinds of attack paths that you can create from manual context gathering. Lastly, we want to look at how the accounts are interacting with each other. So the first place that I like to look for this kind of thing is AWS organizations. I like to figure out who the management account is, what different accounts are used for, and basically look at these trust policies. And there's lots of other configurations that we can talk about. But I also like to consider service control policies at this point. So service control policies are guardrails that are going to ruin your attack paths. So why not consider those and make sure that you're spending your time wisely, because we're ultimately trying to deliver value to the client. And you're going to be combining your notes on attack paths and making a hypothesis like, well, it looks like there's a service control policy, and maybe I need to pivot to a different account before I can actually try some of these attack paths that I've created. So we've done all this manual context gathering, and we've explored the different logical levels, as I like to call them, and we've gotten some relevant context, and we've kept notes on attack paths. Well, what do we do now? We use dynamic testing with that assumed breach position, and we're going to treat those attack paths as a hypothesis, and we're going to confirm and disprove them. Of course, we're going to write our findings, and we're also going to use all of that context we've gathered to make better recommendations. And I like to make recommendations that what I call aren't whack-a-mole fixes. So an example of this might be you have a client that keeps coming back to you, and they always have this IAM test user that has access keys that have been persisting for a long time. Well, you can potentially eliminate that entire class of issue with something like a service control policy that doesn't allow you to create IAM users in the first place. But you would have to understand the relevant context before you can make that recommendation, because there might be valid use cases for that. So by using all this relevant context, we can create a better pen test for our clients. And this is a high-level overview of all the stuff that I've been talking about, but I also want to talk about the limitations of this approach. So the first one is scale. So if we're doing this for 100 accounts, this is incredibly time-consuming, and you're going to have a ton of notes. And this is actually an area that I think needs to be better explored for pen testers, is how do you note-take and keep all of this relevant context with tools? Because that's an excellent area that you can look for automation or things like LLMs maybe even to assist you. There's also another problem with having a methodology like this, which is that I'm just one person that wrote mine. There could be hundreds of people who have different methodologies, and right now for cloud, there's not one that we can point to and say, this is the one that everybody's doing. And with that comes problems. Things like scan and rebrand vendors is what I like to call them, and those are the people who are going to take Scout Suite and Prowler. They're going to get all of the HTML reports and then basically rebrand them as if they did a complete pen test. And there's not really a great way to understand if that's happened to you unless you also happen to have cloud security experts on your security teams. Lastly, if you don't have a standard for people to learn from, then how are you going to train the people who come after you and make sure that they're following a consistent way and a repeatable way? And it's going to differ if they're all at different consulting firms or trying to come up with their own independently. So I thought to myself, well, maybe somebody should start that. Maybe somebody should start a project for making sure that there's at least something that we can point to and have as a community-accepted guideline. So this is where we're at. We're in the create it phase. So this is actually where we want to create the documentation that we wish we had when we started, and then open source it. But then we also need to find a place where it can be maintained, and preferably maintained by practitioners, and keep out things like blatant promotion, where somebody's trying to sell you something when you're just trying to learn or you're just trying to do a comprehensive pen test. After that phase, you need to actually have folks use it and train people around it. And this last one I just threw in here because we love walls of shame around here. But maybe we should have a scan and rebrand hall of shame or wall of shame. So if you're interested in helping me, I could use some people who are doing this AWS pen testing work to give me their thoughts and opinions on my framework and see if we can come up with something better or use the one that I've already created. And the best way to do that is to contact me on the Cloud Security Forum Slack. But I'm also available at different places like Mastodon and Medium. So please reach out to me if you're interested in helping me create something that's an open source methodology. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We've got one question from the Slack, and then if you have a question, throw your hand up and I will run over there with a microphone. Do you have any advice for pen testers following this is methodologies, but I believe it's methodologies, for still finding room for creativity, unique flair in their work? Though if it is a mythology, please let us know.
So if I understand the question correctly, they're asking like for room for creativity if you're following a methodology?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's why I tried to write mine as high level as possible, because the more prescriptive that you make a methodology, the more brittle it becomes. And then you have people who have very opinionated workflows, is the way that I'm going to phrase that. And there's a ton of room for creativity when you're talking about doing things in a high level way. I tried to present this as something that's a framework to operate from, that you could throw anything in there. So you're going to do automated stuff, you're going to do manual stuff, and eventually you're going to test. Just the way that you do that is efficient. So I guess there's a lot of room for creativity as long as you're looking from the perspective of how can I add to this and make it my own.
Okay, thank you. Anybody in the room? Okay. Well, thank you so much. Give our speaker a big round of applause.